The 2020 season is over, and despite being a shortened calendar, it was perhaps the most exciting year of the hybrid era. So, I'm going to rank each race of the 2020 season. My categories are Will Watch Again, Might Watch the Highlights, Bang Average, A Bit Boring, and Get Off the Calendar. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Race 1, Austria. We started the season back in July in Austria at the Red Bull Ring. It was exciting to see Formula 1 back after a prolonged absence due to the pandemic, and after qualifying there were some interesting results, with Lando Norris out-qualifying the Red Bull of Alex Albon for 4th position, and the Ferrari drivers being down in 7th and 11th, which proved that their power unit was significantly worsened after the off-season regulation clarification from the FIA. The race was an exciting one, with 2 safety cars, including one towards the end of the race that resulted in Albon pitting for fresh tyres, and the Mercedes cars staying out ahead. It was a really exciting battle, but ended in Hamilton colliding with Albon and spinning him into the gravel, which gave Hamilton a 5-second time penalty. That then meant that both Leclerc and Norris could get within that time of the world champion to take the 2nd and 3rd spots on the podium. It was a great season opener, and the Red Bull Ring almost certainly produced a more exciting race than the normal season opener would have done at Albert Park in Australia. So I'm going to put this race in the Will Watch Again category. A bit of a rogue choice, but I think that for a season opener after such a long break, the anticipation for the race and how exciting it was puts it in the top tier. Race 2, Austria 2. For the first time in F1 history, we had a second race at the same track layout on the following weekend. This means that there was some apprehension prior to the race start, with it not being clear whether it would throw up the same type of race as the weekend prior. But a wet qualifying mixed up the grid, with Russell qualifying his Williams in 12th. In my opinion, it was a less exciting race than the week before, but it also wasn't that boring. Early on, there was an incident between the Ferrari drivers that meant both retired early on in the race, and there were some dramatic closing laps as Sergio Perez limped home with a damaged front wing after an attempted overtake on Alex Albon, meaning he lost a position to Norris behind him. And then there were just 0.2 of a second between Perez in 5th and Ricciardo in 7th, with Stroll between them. This result, for me, puts it below the first race, but it's still in the Might Watch the Highlights category, as there were some exciting moments, but it didn't quite live up to the opening race of the season. Race 3, Hungary. Round 3 of the 2020 season was at the Hungaroring, a track that's known as Monaco without the walls, as the track is very narrow with limited overtaking opportunities. Racing Point, in their Mercedes lookalike car, qualified in 3rd and 4th as the Red Bulls struggled, qualifying in 7th and 13th. The race on Sunday was somewhat anticlimactic though, after a promising looking qualifying. With wet conditions, Max Verstappen crashed on his way to the grid, and the Red Bull team did an incredible job of repairing his suspension and front wing in time for the formation lap. The conditions were changing though in the run-up to the race, which brought about some debate as to which tyres would be optimum for the start of the race. The Haas cars came in to switch tyres after the formation lap, a move that looked inspired and led to Magnussen scoring his first and only points of the season. There was significant debate about whether the race would end up seeing more rain, but in the end it wasn't to be, as Max Verstappen ended up having an impressive drive from 7th to 2nd, behind Hamilton and ahead of Bottas. So overall, a race that showed a lot of promise and fairly little excitement for it, so a bit boring for me. Race 4, Great Britain. The first of 2 races at Silverstone was next on the shortened calendar, and we had a driver change after Perez contracted COVID. Nico Hülkenberg was selected as a stand-in for the Racing Point driver, and the race got off to a fairly exciting start with a couple of safety car periods. But soon enough, the race settled down and it was looking like it would end with a Hamilton-Bottas-Verstappen podium. But this was up until the closing stages of the race, on a track which was demanding on the tyres. With 3 laps to go, Bottas' tyre delaminated, meaning he had to limp back to the pits. Verstappen then dived into the pits to take advantage of the now large gap behind him to Leclerc as Bottas dropped through the field. Carlos Sainz then ran into his own issues from 4th position as his front left tyre also delaminated. To top it off, Hamilton then had his own puncture on the final lap, with a rapid Verstappen closing the Brit down on fresh tyres. He only managed to get the gap down to 6 seconds by the finish line after a tense lap. These exciting closing stages were a saving grace for the race really, but as a whole I'd put it down as a bang average race. Race 5, Great Britain 2. Once again, the F1 circus returned to Silverstone for a second race. This time, the focus was on the tyres. Much like the previous race, it wasn't clear how the tyres would react after the failures of the previous weekend. And it was this issue that was causing the Mercedes drivers significant trouble, as they ended up being quite poor on the tyres as they developed blisters early, meaning that they had to pit early on. However, Verstappen in the Red Bull had been able to make his tyres last longer than the others, pitting 13 laps later than the Mercedes drivers, and despite ending up behind Bottas straight after the pit stop, he swiftly got past the Finn on the fresher tyres. Verstappen ended up having a fairly smooth race to win, the first non-Mercedes victory of the season. However, it was a bit of a boring race overall, with fairly limited action. Race 6, Spain. The next race was quite frankly the first dreadful race of the season. There was pretty much zero action, and only 3 drivers finished the race on the lead lap. It was an absolute masterclass from Hamilton as he cruised to victory by 24 seconds, as his teammate finished a further 20 seconds behind Verstappen. It was an impressive drive, but sadly a race that didn't offer any excitement for the viewers. I think the calendar needs to see the end of this track, as it's just become too predictable with all the testing that the teams do at the Circuit de Catalunya. So, it should come as no surprise that this is the first race in the Get Off the Calendar tier. Race 7, Belgium. The following race was at Spa in Belgium, a staple race on the Formula 1 calendar. This year's event was not a classic by any means, but there were a few events to mention. After a safety car on lap 10 following Giovinazzi's crash, there was an intriguing choice for the teams, as it was probably a bit early for the standard pit strategies. All but 2 drivers chose to make the pit stop, with the 2 drivers staying out being Pierre Gasly and Sergio Perez. On the race restart, they were in 4th and 5th respectively, but soon fell through the order before pitting and coming back through the field to both score points. Overall, however, I would say the race was a bit boring. Lewis Hamilton won the race from pole, and once again Valtteri Bottas and Max Verstappen joined him on the podium. There was also a notable performance for Daniel Ricciardo as he ended the race in 4th with the fastest lap. But still, these things didn't really make up for the fact that it was a bit of a boring race. Race 8, Italy. Next up was the first of 3 races in Italy during this predominantly European season. Monza hosted the first of these races, and it was an event that certainly won't be forgotten anytime soon. After a couple of surprise results in qualifying, particularly with the McLaren's Carlos Sainz taking 3rd on the grid after an impressive lap, from the start, Bottas fell from 2nd on the grid, dropping to 6th position on lap 1 after a poor getaway. But it was on lap 18 that the race turned as Kevin Magnussen retired with a power unit failure. It was the location of the Haas car that caused the issues, as it was so close to the pit entrance. Pierre Gasly chose to pit as soon as Magnussen stopped, and managed to get through the pits before the pit lane was eventually closed. However, both Giovinazzi and the race leader, Lewis Hamilton, went into the pit lane after it was closed, which gave them both 10-second stop-go penalties. Soon after the pit lane reopened, but before the safety car came in, the majority of the field then entered the pits, leaving Hamilton leading from Gasly and Stroll, the only driver who chose not to stop, in 3rd position on track. On the restart lap, Charles Leclerc had a heavy crash at the Parabolica, which brought out a red flag. And on the race restart, Hamilton and Giovinazzi served their 10-second stop-go penalties, meaning they dropped to the back of the field. Once this had happened, Gasly inherited the lead, with Kimi Raikkonen and Carlos Sainz behind, in 2nd and 3rd. After a thrilling end to the race, with a battle for the lead between Carlos Sainz and Pierre Gasly, the race eventually led to Pierre Gasly's first win, with Sainz in 2nd and Lance Stroll taking 3rd position. It was an incredible race that resulted in the first podium without Mercedes, Red Bull and Ferrari since 2012. For me, it was a classic that I will definitely watch again. Race 9, Italy 2. Race 9 of the season was once again hosted in Italy, but it was at a different venue, as it was at Mugello, a track that most of the teams and drivers had not visited previously. The first lap of the race led to a number of incidents and a couple of retirements for Verstappen and Gasly, and a number of other drivers being forced to pit due to damage. The debris brought out the safety car, which ended up being brought in again at the end of lap 6, but the accordion effect ended up with one of the worst crashes of the season, as the cars started to speed up but had to slow back down at the restart. The incident brought out a red flag, and ended up with 4 drivers retiring. The race then continued, but then there was another red flag on lap 45 after a puncture led to a high-speed crash for Lance Stroll with a barrier repair required. The race ended up with just 12 finishes and ended up with Alex Albon's maiden Formula 1 podium, behind Hamilton and Bottas ahead of him. It was a good race, and therefore for that reason I'm going to put the race in the Might Watch the Highlights category. Race 10, Russia. Next up was Russia. Famously disappointing track that rarely produces quality racing, and once again, the track delivered a disappointing race. After qualifying, Hamilton started on pole from Verstappen and Bottas, but there was an incident-filled first lap with Sainz and Stroll both retiring in separate incidents. Hamilton received 2 separate 5-second penalties for completing practice starts at the wrong part of the pit lane, which then resulted in him dropping to 3rd. But other than a couple of penalties for track limit infringements for Ricciardo and Albon, there was very little going on in the race. The fact that penalties were the real reason for the result, and really the only highlights in the race, for me says it all for this track. It can get off the calendar for me. Race 11, Germany. The F1 teams then returned to the Nürburgring for the first time since 2013. Lewis Hamilton overtook Bottas for the lead on lap 13 after starting behind the Finnish driver as he forced him into a lockup into turn 1. There were a number of incidents throughout the race, which meant reliability playing a significant factor as 5 drivers retired from the race. There wasn't too much else to note other than Ricciardo achieving his first podium for Renault, and Hamilton equalling Schumacher's record for race victories. For me, it was a bang average race, nothing special to shout about really. Race 12, Portugal. This season took Formula 1 back to Portugal for the first time since 1996. The start of the race was particularly exciting as Carlos Sainz went from 7th to 2nd on lap 1 and overtook Bottas for the lead on lap 2, as the wet-dry conditions meant that the drivers starting on the medium tyres dropped back through the field as they struggled to heat them up. Once they got the tyres going though, the Mercedes drivers went on to dominate the race, with Hamilton ending up winning the race by 25 seconds from Valtteri Bottas. Overall, there were just 4 drivers on the lead lap in the end, but the first few laps of excitement mean it wasn't boring for me, so I'm going to put the race at Portimao in the bang average category. Race 13, Italy 3. Round 13 of the season took the teams to Imola for the first time since 2006. Whilst the teams were excited to be at Imola, they were also apprehensive of whether the larger cars would be able to overtake at the narrow circuit. The race was an interesting one as Bottas picked up debris early on in the race on lap 2, which hampered the rest of his afternoon. Hamilton managed to leapfrog Bottas in the pits during a virtual safety car, and Bottas was eventually passed by Verstappen before a spectacular rear tyre blowout meant he spun off into the gravel trap. George Russell then managed to spin behind the safety car to ruin his first real chance at achieving Formula 1 points. We then had a safety car restart towards the end of the race where Ricciardo defended his 3rd position from some faster cars behind him. I enjoyed the race overall, and I think I might watch the highlights for it going forwards, although perhaps this is for the nostalgia of that time that F1 went back to Imola. Race 14, Turkey. The race in Turkey came with significant anticipation, with fans and drivers both looking forward to that infamous Turn 8, which the drivers were expecting to take flat. However, the track owners decided to resurface the circuit just 2 weeks before the event, meaning it was unexpectedly slippery, with the cars struggling to find the grip and mixed weather conditions meaning that the teams had little preparation prior to the competitive events in qualifying in the race. The qualifying event threw up a completely unexpected result, with Lance Stroll taking his maiden pole position and a completely mixed up grid behind him. The race also started in the wet, and Lance Stroll controlled the race early on, leading most of the opening 35 laps. Perez then inherited the lead after Stroll's pit stop before being overtaken by Lewis Hamilton, who went on to win his 7th World Championship in style, winning the race by over 30 seconds, lapping his teammate in the process. But the podium was then completed by Sergio Perez and Sebastian Vettel, a shock result with drama throughout as it was an unpredictable outcome with changes even on the final lap in the fight for 3rd position. There were also some unsung performances from the likes of Carlos Sainz on the way to 5th position from 15th on the grid. It was an exciting race and one that I'll definitely watch again, although it isn't the type of race I'd want to see every week. Race 15, Bahrain. Bahrain was next up as the season entered the closing stages, and the first race at the circuit will always be remembered for that horrendous accident for Romain Grosjean in the Haas on lap 1, during which the halo saved the French driver's life as his car went through the Armco barrier. After the race restart, the majority of drivers went for the two-stop strategy, with Perez going for the counter one-stop. He was running in third before an engine failure towards the end of the race forced him to retire. Hamilton eventually went on to win the race from Verstappen and Albon behind him, but the race was bang average for me, from a racing perspective. Race 16, Bahrain 2. The penultimate race of the season was also hosted in Bahrain, but on the outer circuit instead of the standard layout. This was met with excitement as the cars would be running sub 1 minute laps around the circuit. The anticipation for the event was built on as George Russell was selected to take over for Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes car after his positive COVID-19 diagnosis. After an exciting qualifying event where the first 3 positions were decided by less than a tenth of a second, George Russell took the lead going into the first corner and led the race before an incident behind going into turn 4, which took Leclerc and Verstappen out of the race and put eventual race winner Sergio Perez to the back of the pack. It was then great to watch as Sergio Perez came back through the field, and there was also a late drama as stand-in Williams drivers Jack Aitken ended up losing his front wing after spinning at the final turn, meaning there was a virtual safety car that ended up becoming a full safety car after the debris was too difficult to clear. This was where the race became more exciting, as the Mercedes team made that failed double-stack pit stop. Russell started to come back through the field before he ended up with a puncture towards the end that dropped him back down the order. It gave Formula 1 its second maiden winner of the season, as Sergio Perez came back to win the race for Racing Point. And so for me, after all that action, it's yet another race that I would watch again from this season. Race 17, Abu Dhabi. The final race of the year was once again in Abu Dhabi, and to be honest, there was not a lot to note after Max Verstappen took the win under the lights with Bottas and Hamilton behind him. It was perhaps one of the most uneventful events of the season, which has become a running theme at the Abu Dhabi track, so for me, it needs to get off the calendar. So, that's my tier list for the 2020 Formula 1 season. Let me know what you think in the comments and leave a like and subscribe if you've watched this far. And as always, the link for the tier list is in the description.